Hey everybody, I want to thank everyone for being here. This is a panel where we put together on 2D game art for solo and small teams. We've got a variety of panelists here who are working on, in some cases solo, in some cases small team projects, and they're going to be sharing tips for ways that perhaps you, as someone building games, you may not have art training, you may not have a ton of time to make assets and things. What are their strategies? How to make it work? And we've gathered questions off of YouTube, Twitter, and Mastodon and other platforms. I've got it on my secondary screen here. We'll be reading and discussing as a panel. We start some quick introductions. I'm Chris. I teach online through something called HomeTeam GameDev. People make freeware games for practice when they get stuck. Me and my trainers help them. We made over 170 games this way in the past 7 or 8 years. Zigzaggy career, but these days I'm a teacher. Let me pass it over to Julia to introduce.
Hi, I'm Julia Minamata. I'm a solo game dev. I'm working on the Crimson Diamond, which is kind of a mystery point-and-click adventure game. I've also worked with Strange Scaffold on a few projects, including Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator, which is released, Witch Strandings as well, and a game for Playdate called Recommendation Dog, which is to be released soon, I hope. So we'll see about that. I also like to stream on Tuesdays. I stream my game dev, like art and music, on Tuesdays for Crimson Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. And I'm going to throw it over to Aureus.
Hi, I'm Aureus. I'm the person behind Road Warden, and that's pretty much all I have to say. Thanks for having me.
Hi, my name's Freya. I've been a solo game developer for, I think, 5 or 6 years, and doing all my own art for lots of small little kind of web games. And since then, I now work for Supermassive Games as a game designer, although I don't do any art there. And that's it. I have nothing to promote because all my work's on NDA that I've done in the last year. So I'm going to bounce it on to DeLeon.
Hi, I'm Damien. I've mostly done solo development work for the past 10 years. Most of my projects are weird RPGs, such as, Purgatory Dungeoneer, which was published by the people at Strange Scaffold, or more people know me for games where you have way too many characters trailing after you, like I have low stats for my class as leader, so I recruited everyone I know to fight the Dark Lord. So that's what I do. I'll pass it to Francisco.
Hi, I'm Francisco. I am also a solo dev focused on point-and-click adventure games. I've been doing it as I started off doing it as a hobby in 2001 and started doing it commercially in 2014. I've released 4 games ranging from historical fiction piece about a real estate agent to post-apocalyptic disease curing games to Victorian detective games. I'm currently working on a Western point and click, and I too do all the art, and it's very daunting, but we'll clear up how to do it here. So hi, thank you for having me.
Awesome, thank you everybody. And we'll jump right into questions. Afterwards, might also just kind of keep spinning the ball, see what else we have thoughts in mind. But I want to start with viewer questions that we've gathered, again, secondary screens, so they're not part of the recording here. But the first comes to us from a YouTube commenter, Break the Loop. Let's see here. Seeing the sheer variety of different scenes and camera angles in some of the panelist games makes me think about the daunting amount of art that's needed. Do you ever feel overwhelmed at the number of outstanding to-do items remaining in your game? How do you combat this feeling of being overwhelmed and needing to touch up hundreds of different things? Hundreds actually sounds optimistic to me, but does anyone want to speak to that first?
My key point for this is I say get comfortable with knowing that it's going to be a lot of repetition and the same thing over and over again, and that you're probably going to be bored, but you need to be able to do it anyway. If it's important to do, then you have to just kind of sit there and get it done and dealt with anyway. So I say just get comfortable with the boredom.
I would have an answer to that, which is if you are kind of feeling aghast at having hundreds of things to touch up, I would ask, do you need to do 100 things? Like, I think a lot of when I do art is how little can I get away with doing and how much can I convey with something that isn't 100 unique assets. So, just not doing 100 is a valid option if you're scared of it.
It's speaking not just about assets, but just in terms of all the things that have to get done, and that being a daunting task. I find a lot of things help me with that. I think one of them is scheduling can be important, and planning and having a routine and saying, this is the day I do this, and this is the day I do this. When I stream, I say, okay, that half day I'm going to prep for stream, but also I might add something to my merch store. I might do other things that are related to the game, but not really the game. After the stream, I know I'm prepping like video thumbnails and I'm uploading video and stuff. And that's kind of that day taken care of. So I know what that day looks like. The other days I can prioritize what I need to do. That can be difficult if you're a solo because you have to decide what to prioritize, and that can be a bit of an issue. For me, I try to concentrate on if the game doesn't work, if the game is crashing. I just released a new version of my demo for Steam Mystery Fest, and about a couple hours after I released it, someone said, "Hey, by the way, it's crashing," and I said, "Oh, that's not good." So that's definitely the priority. But I've since then gotten a bunch of other bugs reported, and I'm just gonna let them be for now because there's so many other things to do, and that's a decision you kind of have to make on your own. And that can be super difficult. Another thing I want to mention about this is in terms of doing a bunch of different things, sometimes doing one thing actually covers a lot of bases at the same time. I've had this really, really good experience with streaming, and streaming actually covers a lot of bases because it's really good for me to promote my game with. I actually do game art on stream, so that's another thing that it takes care of. It's also really good for me when I can meet other streamers and when I raid other channels and I get to know other streamers who might play my game and then they might be interested in streaming it. And I've had really good experiences with that as well. And it's a matter of that's a good thing. And I want to keep in my schedule because I know that it covers all those other bases at once.
I enjoy playing some tricks on my mind because, for example, making a very simple task list in a notepad file helps me by showing me, oh, I make things, the list is getting shorter. Actually, I'm making progress, even it's in reality, I made like less than 0.5% of progress today. I feel as if I made something large, and it helps me going through.
Yeah, I feel like organization is definitely difficult sometimes, especially like when you're at the point in the project when you have so much and you're not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel just yet. So I usually just deal with it like what Julia said, just kind of picking what to do on a certain day, like, or even a week, like dedicate a week to doing backgrounds, for example. And if I get tired of that, switch over to character art, or just being able to make it fresh by switching disciplines in a way, like, and also beyond. I mean, I know this is an art panel, so it might not apply to anyone who's exclusively doing art, but like sometimes I'll switch to like writing or something just to take my mind off of art for a while. But even within art, just like, yeah, switching up what you do. And then, yeah, like to-do lists are good, especially like I find personally just the satisfaction of writing it down and crossing it out makes me feel like, yes, I did it. So there's that.
Feels like one of the things being touched on there, right, is that sometimes we'll look at from a distance solo developers and think about the programming, the writing, the art, whatever. Really, you're also having to wear a producer hat. And so, like Freya said, like maybe how many tasks do we need? Or Damien, like, is that our strength? And just these various strategies for like scheduling, for planning, for realizing overlapping marketing, two birds, one stone. Awesome set of tools. I want to thank everybody for your answers there on Break the Loops question. Got a second question here from Edward. I'm just going to kind of focus on the first half of this one. What are the best tips for amateur artists or designers with no artistic experience in designing sprites?
Practice always helps. If you, one thing that I've looked at when I was especially starting out, but also when I was trying to do more lo-fi stuff, was you have to study what works. Like look at Game Boy games, right? You're working with a 4-color palette there. That already takes care of a lot of decisions out the gate. Especially if you follow all the restrictions, like screen size, or each sprite is 16 by 16 or what have you. If you're able to figure out like, okay, these are the rules that they followed, or let me try doing this way, like do a bush, and then you go, oh, okay, so the Legend of Zelda, they actually did theirs this way, and you can figure out why does theirs work compared to what yours did, or maybe you prefer yours for whatever reason. Maybe it's the stylization, maybe it's just it reduced, you ended up doing it with 3 colors, so you're able to see the character sprite more, whatever. So really, I think it comes down to, you study what works, you try making your own things comparable, and then you see what does and doesn't work.
I think also it can be hard if you're just working on a sprite to feel kind of comfortable with it and feel like, yeah, I've really done this, especially when you're quite new to art or you just think you're not very good. But trying to work on stuff in context helps. And so you might kind of, with one sprite alone, go, it sucks. And then you put the sprite in a world of various tiles and you go like, actually, you know what? It's pulling its weight. It doesn't need to be the best sprite because with everything else, it's all kind of supporting it and giving it context. especially when it's, kind of like an 8x8 pixel thing. You're having to abstract it anyway. And so sometimes you can make a sprite that kind of standalone. You're like, this is rubbish. But that abstraction is being supported by everything else you do.
Also, you have to take into consideration that if you, say, spend hours and hours making this wonderfully detailed sprite, and then you realize, oh, I have to animate this throughout the rest of my game, there's a there's a certain level of, now you have to dedicate a lot more time to this. So yeah, you don't want to you want to scale back as much as possible if you're just starting out. Or also, it can also be a way to sort of discover your style in a way, because when I started out, I basically was trying to make adventure games that emulated like the classic like Sierra Online games. So I just sort of made my little guy sprite semi-realistic proportions was as best I could do at the time. And then as I went on, I realized I wanted to embrace rotoscoping. So then I started, taking photographic images and tracing over them and stuff like that. So, and that's the style that I've embraced. So in a way, like not knowing what I was doing and then just trying out something else was what led me to figure out what my style was.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about this. So, of course, we've all mentioned so far about keeping things kind of a lower resolution helps. Limiting the palette really helps. Also, with a sprite, you have to think about animation and how animated something's going to be. That's also something that's going to really increase and multiply how much production time you have on assets. If you have a sprite that's like 16 frames of animation versus 3 frames of animation, that's going to make a big difference on how long things take. Something you might want to keep in mind when you're designing a sprite is having it be discernible, each part of the sprite being discernible, even at a low resolution. A really classic example of that is something like Mario, where he's got the hat and the mustache, and that helps differentiate different parts of his body. On my sprites that I designed, my main sprite has a belt with a belt buckle. And so you can see the belt buckle moving on her torso. You can tell that she's twisting and turning, and her arms have different, like she's got different sleeves on her arms and things. And you can see that helps visual landmarking in terms of discerning what's going on at those low resolutions and limited color palettes. And the other thing to mention about sprites is, you might not even really have sprites in your game if your game is like a first person perspective game. If you think that animating sprites is really daunting, first of all, you can there are solutions to limiting the amount of actual animation that's in a game. A really good example of that is a game called Inspector Waffles, where it is a traditional looking adventure game, but it's very limited animation, but it's done in such a way that you don't really notice that there's any real lack of animation. Or like I said, first person type of games where there aren't sprites and people. It more focuses on the background art. So that's another way to go about things if you feel like maybe you're not that comfortable with sprites, or you want to make a game but you're not interested in making a sprite.
As I was preparing the first few scenes in my game Road Warden, one of the first enemy encounters the player can face is a small group of griffons. And back in 2019, I tried to portray how those griffons could look like. And I decided, well, I can do this right now, so I'll just go ahead and focus on other parts of my game. And a few years went by, I never drew the griffins because I drew not a single sprite for my game, and it has no sprite. It just has those empty chambers or pieces portraying the wilderness that add to the haunting atmosphere of the game or to its somber mood. And I think that for most of the time, it's good to just not obsess on one single imperfection you may have. It may turn out that, for example, your game will have some weak visuals at first, but you then may add those other pieces that are essential for your game, and then you may discover your style, or may discover that your game is actually awesome and you can find help somewhere else, someone who would draw some things for you because all those other things are just top notch.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that example of the griffins never being. It's like I'm reminded of the old Hollywood films where the monsters it was pre-computer graphics and they couldn't show a whole monster. Movie's kind of creepier because you just see a tail whipping by and it's in your head, right? Next question comes from Twitter. It's from user Jim Plays Games. how do you go about making art for something that there isn't really a good reference for, like coming up with a spaceship or something alien looking?
When I design monsters and stuff, I usually just draw lines and add too many teeth or mouths or eyes, and then decide what material and what else to do for them. I mean, for my very first game, I remember I had like something like 60 different monsters I wanted to put in. And so I just started making notes like, okay, well, we'll have like, and I just started hybridizing things. I was like, yeah, we'll have a vampire butterfly and a cyclops slime and stuff like this. And so you just figure out like, okay, well, we'll make it out of this material. You know, we'll have this be furry instead, or we'll actually make this organic monster be really hard and not necessarily scaly, but like just made out of some weird or material, right? You don't need to do too much to make something look terribly different from everything else. You just take one thing and take it too far.
I would say for this idea, it's to concentrate on what the function of the thing is that you are actually designing. So if it's like, let's say it's a spaceship, an alien spaceship, well, you want the spaceship to look shiny. What else is shiny? Like toasters are shiny and cars are shiny. Also, is it moving through the air? Is it flying? Is it, sailing like a ship? Is it flying like a bird? Then you start combining different elements of different things. I want it to be shiny like a toaster. I want it to fly like a bird. And then you start, putting those things together, and then you can come up with something that's going to look very different, but it will make sense in the context of you're making, because it's going to perform the action that you needed to perform in the game that you're making.
Following on from that mention of like household objects, if you're doing something like a spaceship, I always find I look at something like the Dyson vacuum cleaner I've got, and I think that'd make a cool spaceship or like a cool gun or something. And so taking something that's kind of familiar and then just like using the silhouette, using the shapes and saying like, oh, I'll stick an engine on here and cool. Now this vacuum cleaner is like a spaceship or something. It's got, the big kind of bulbous bit and the long neck and so if you're trying to come up with something that hasn't got a real life reference, just use something that is already there as a reference, even if it's unrelated. And if it's like, something alien looking, food is alien looking if you look up close, like the texture of a grapefruit or something up close, this weird kind of like pattern. So there's it kind of, if you look at things with a like, what else could that be? Then that's a good way of coming up with references for stuff that doesn't technically have one.
Yeah, this isn't quite specifically sci-fi or alien, but like in my current game, Rosewater, which is a Western, but it's an alternate history Western that has like steampunky elements. There's plenty of like steampunk references, but a lot of the times people tend to go over the top with them. I call it steampunk-ish because it's not quite so over the top. The main part of the game is you're going on this journey with 5 people on a wagon. So I was like, all right, well, I need a steampunk wagon. So my references were just like, okay, well, I'll look up wagons from like the Oregon Trail to start. And then I also was like, okay, but it has to be practical and steampunky. So it's basically a self-driving thing that has space for 5 or 6 people. So then I looked at like RVs and like minivan, or not minivans, but like RVs and mobile homes and things like that. And then I was like, all right, well, I can take one of those, like a modern RV, make it look like an old wagon, but also add like engines to it so it looks like steampunk. So just picking and choosing little things like that. Yeah, just like from already existing things helps also.
No thoughts on it, Aris?
Not really.
Fair enough. No worries. All right, so then our next question we've got from Krister McFunkyPants on Twitter. How do you choose colors? Any advice on ways to make art pop with color, light, tone, palette choices? And this is one we had actually a recurring pattern. Several different people ask comparable questions that basically they're stuck on color selection. Even if you're using like pre-existing palette, now you mentioned Game Boy, I think Julie might use EGA or something. How or why'd you pick that as opposed to the millions of color options that are out there?
I will say that I'm super basic when it comes to this question. I like complementary colors, and my favorite complementary colors are orange and blue. So if I have a night scene, I will paint it in orange and blue. And if I have a day scene, I'll do it like yellows and purples. And it's simple, but there's a reason that it works. So I try not to stress too much about it, but like at the very basic level, I'm like, okay, well, I want to at least make it look interesting by using complementary colors.
I'd also recommend to not try to reinvent the wheel. Those thousands and thousands of already made color palettes online are there to help you. So maybe you won't find the perfect one, but a good one that's good enough to help you prototype your game or to just make the first few steps. So don't stick on a single issue even if it's not just the right one, it's probably good enough.
You can get like color palette generators and stuff online where you press a button and it gives you a new palette. And honestly, sometimes when I've been stuck and stuff, I've just sat there like new palette, new palette, new palette, and let the machine decide. But also, like, you can't go wrong with black and white and then one accent color, which is my default fallback, which I feel a bit self-conscious about, but it works. And so, if you use the same palette enough, then you've developed a style and suddenly you have a recognizable color style.
For my game, the Crimson Diamond, of course, it does have this color palette here, particularly the EGA color palette. I wore it specially today. The powerful thing about existing color palettes, particularly ones that are bound to particular like eras or platforms or types of games, is that it can be a really strong draw for people who remember and recognize those color palettes. So of course, yeah, my color palette is from a very specific time in adventure games, so kind of the golden age of Sierra LucasArts adventure games. And the hope was for me was, yeah, when people see this color palette, they'll have all these nice warm feelings that would bring them back to that type of game, or that when they were kids, basically. And of course, that can be said for Game Boy games, that can be Commodore 64 games, or even like Macintosh games, black and white games, of course, as well. So that's a good reason to, yeah, I mean, if you were interested in exploring that aspect of it, for sure, that's a good way. I think people, definitely do get hung up on like the perfect color palette or the perfect set of colors, when I think, as Freya said, it's kind of more important to focus on like function and say, okay, I need this to work. I need the important stuff on the screen to stand out. So I'm going to use color for that, and I need the player to know where they can go, walk through the screen. That's important. Focusing on what the color is going to be doing for you in the game, and if it's going to be communicating the appropriate information for a player, is going to be a good starting point. And of course, I do agree that starting off with something black and white can be super helpful. There's just so many amazing games, even nowadays, that are coming out, like Return of the Obra Dinn and World of Horror, that are black and white, and they're spectacular. There's no real need to go into color, and I can understand why this is such an important topic for people. And this is what was our most asked question for this panel, was how to pick color. It's not as important as people think, as long as the color is working for you. I pretty much is how I feel about it.
It's something that I've struggled with because I've never had really good skill with picking palettes or making them or anything. I mean, for this last one, I was like, okay, you're going to be inside a fair bit. I need to make sure if we're doing wood tables and wood floorings, we need at least 2 different colors for the wood. Like that was one of my big concerns. But like outside of that, I'm like, whatever, this character's green, this character's blue, because we're doing super lo-fi roguelike thing. Who really cares? Like as long as there's some amount of color coding, and even I put outlines around all of the characters just so that way I didn't have to worry too much about, okay, if somebody's colorblind or something, which reason to be considerate of that during your palette selection if you're using a wide variety of colors. You need to be able to at least see where everything is. You need to know what is interactable and what isn't. So that's really all I have found concern with. And yeah.
Right before this, we're kind of briefly chatting during setup that today I wore the same color as my background, completely oblivious. I could use an outline today, but I'm the moderator, so it's better for me to fall into the background anyway. That's my argument. We've got a next question. This one might have a little overlap from the previous, or from a couple of questions ago, but H. Strayford on YouTube asked, what tends to drive how time-consuming a piece of art or animation is? Not really thinking so much from like a scheduling lens, than just with things take into consideration, trying to decide if something's a big ask, perhaps if working with another artist, or even just trying to think about project-wise what's unreasonable solo small team to be tackling.
Frames of animation. Animation, because you're having to do the same thing a lot of different times, and you have to make sure it all works together. And if it doesn't work together very well, you have a bunch that you have to double check and redo. frame 1 has to go to frame 2, has to go to frame 3, and it has to work. So animation just always takes a lot of extra time. Outside of that, it's how detailed are you trying to get with it? Are we talking a simple Game Boy style like explosion? Or are we talking, Final Fantasy VI, the entire tile set of the game, right? Like there's definitely a big difference in those aspects.
Also keeping the visuals of your game consistent all the way through. So you may have one background that you decide you want to add all sorts of idle animations to decorate it, but then you have another area and another background and another background. And are you sure that you want to keep the same time of attention to each part? And it may be better to just simplify all of them a bit to make them feel like they belong to the same project.
Also, so this panel is for people who are not as confident in their art. And I think a lot of solo devs have something they are good at and something that they are like, I kind of need to do this, but I'm not that enthusiastic about it. And so if you're unsure how long some things are going to take, it's so different for different people. Like backgrounds, I tend to do very quickly compared to the rest of the art. But then the writing in my games is the fastest for me because that's my main strength. And so some people are going to find certain tasks very easy and very fast, and others are going to find things kind of like they just hit a wall with it, whether it's something that's technically difficult or that they just find kind of like emotionally difficult. And I'd say if you're trying to find like time estimates for working out how long something's going to take, do like a tiny vertical slice, do a little bit of everything that you're kind of weighing up and think, okay, I know I could do this background fast. I know the sprite is going to take me longer. I know this, animation is going to be ungodly amount of time. So I'm not doing the animation. Especially when you're in a small team, it's going to be so personal to you and your own skills and weaknesses as well.
Another thing I think to keep in mind when you're building assets is you might not feel that comfortable with making certain things. Or you might feel like you're slow at certain things, but as you go through the process of making a game and that repetition we're talking about, the repetition is not necessarily always a bad thing. The repetition is practice, and you will get better as you go, and that can get faster. That can be a hard thing to gauge as well, though, because not only will you get faster with the processes that you're practicing, but you also, you'll get better at them, and there'll be this desire to go back and redo things because you feel like, okay, I've gotten better. So you need to like get a handle on that desire and just keep moving forward. You can always go back and fix stuff later. That's always like the magic rule for me is, I think on this panel, we've talked a lot about good enough. It's good enough. You can just leave it for now. Just good enough. We're going to move on. Because that can be the enemy of progress, is this idea that you want to make everything perfect before you move on to things. Of course, we've covered, size, the resolution of stuff, color, the frames of animation. Also tools and workflow, depending on, a lot of us work 2D, and I think there's a big reason for that is because it's just an easier workflow. 3D games, there's so much to deal with. Like there's lighting, there's texturing, there's stuff I don't even know about that is to do with this stuff. And that's stuff where, the workflow, if you're asking an artist for something, to be aware of all the things that have to be done, there might be certain software, and the software is like really demanding on systems and things, and that can take a long time to render stuff out. Like all those things that come extra with what kind of art you actually are looking for, that can add to what a big ask might be. And also, if you're working with another artist, that aspect is another thing. Like Freya did mention, some artists are faster at certain things than others. Some artists prefer certain types of subject matter over other things. Is this something that, they're interested in, they believe in, or is this something that they're not interested in at all? Another thing is scheduling. It can be a big ask if you need something next week, but it's a less of a big ask if you need something 2, 3, 4 months down the line. In terms of someone scheduling that into their current workflow or having to rearrange their entire schedule to accommodate what you're looking for. So those are other aspects, I think, especially to keep in mind with working with other people.
My answer is a little bit more specific to like when I think about how I'm going to draw like really detailed backgrounds. But of course, if it's your first game and you're thinking about planning backgrounds and things like that, it can be again overwhelming to like think, how am I going to draw this library with like all these bookshelves? it's something that comes with experience, learning how to work efficiently and how to cut corners and like still make it look good, right? So like if you're going to draw a bookshelf or a super detailed library background, you don't have to draw every individual book necessarily. You can just figure out book shapes and then copy and paste and stuff like that. I'm looking at the background behind Julia and I'm like, well, look, that's a symmetrical background. Like I only need to draw half of that, and then flip it and mirror it, and then just like change little details here and there so it doesn't look exactly like a mirrored thing. But like little tips and tricks like that can make you work more efficiently. And like sometimes you can't help it. I mean, I spent 9 days on a background that was a pawn shop, literally just doing like all the little odds and ends and stuff. And sometimes you have to take the hit and do stuff like that. But a lot of times, excuse me, a lot of times once you just figure out like how to minimize your workflow and not spend that much time on those details, then that can help your workflow and help you figure out what's possible and what is a giant ask.
Right on. Yeah, I like this mix of tips. There's some mixture of just kind of this pattern theme throughout. Of some things where cut corners intelligently. There are things that aren't worth the time, and then being able to sometimes putting in the legwork and time on where it makes a difference, and that your advantage is you'll put that time in where somebody else didn't or wouldn't or couldn't. Let's see. We've got a next question. It's actually also sort of echoes some thoughts that Julie had in the previous answer, but comes here from Stampede or QB, and I'm actually going to generalize this a little bit because the question originally was about when do you determine if a map is done, which applies to some of these genres more than others. But let's say in general, like for your art pieces, because you could pick at it forever, right? Like writing, like anything creative, like music, you could just keep editing the same character for your entire life. How do you determine when a piece is done? Sometimes you create one, it looks fine, but a little sparse. You add something, looks nice. Now you need to add a little more, increase level of detail. It's just a rabbit hole of doubt. How do you decide? Cut it, move on. Or, stop spending time on this, rather.
I don't have an answer just yet, but I just want to say I love the term rabbit hole of doubt because it's so perfect.
Yeah, like this is one that because we had the questions in advance, so I wrote down some bullet point answers. And for me, I kind of just go until I get bored. And I get bored kind of easy, and then I'm like, okay, well, does this mean that I actually need this part in here, or can we cut this down? Again, this is a solo developer going, okay, how does this influence the core loop? Like, is there something game design wise I don't like about this, or is this actually an art thing? But yeah, I mean, I tend to do really minimalist stuff anyway, so I kind of just I put in a few things and I go, okay, that's fine, we can move on. And if I want to add more, I would do that later.
I think I'm actually the opposite of Damien in that I will just grind things to dust, and I won't let my own personal feelings of being bored or not interested in something at all dictate how far I go with something. And that's a big problem sometimes because as a solo game developer, it's up to you to decide, make that call about, is this worth it? Is this not worth it? I overcommit big time a lot of the time. And I don't really have much more to add to that, except that, yeah, I mean, I still realize the importance of, moving on, like recognizing when something's working enough and just moving on with it, and looking at other games of the same kind that you like and seeing, okay, well, yeah, they're just doing as enough as possible, and I certainly think that it's effective. I think a lot of times we can be super self-critical about what we have out there, when a lot of times it's going to be fine, and people won't notice what isn't there. That's another thing. So that's all I can really add to that.
And it's good to keep your actual goals ahead of you and know what is it that you try to do. So are you trying to design a masterpiece that's going to hang in a museum, printed, I assume? Or are you actually trying to just communicate some sort of information for your player? Because I assume that, yes, you're making a game for yourself, but you usually make it mainly for other people to see it and to be able to read something out of it. So at one point, you probably just need to assume, okay, I think my message is clear already.
I think there's two kind of contexts in which deciding when something is done comes up, and there's one which is like, okay, I've got 10 or 20 of this identical asset. Say it's a map, say it's a background, say it's a sprite. I could spend unlimited time on one, just get it to perfection, but then, I have to spend that time on every single one. And so sometimes it can be better to say, like, right, I'm going to do half an hour on this, no more. The standard it gets to in half an hour is where I'll keep it. I'll do that time on all the others, and then I can kind of look at the whole batch together and say, well, kind of maybe I need to do another half an hour on all of these. And just stopping yourself kind of laser focusing on like 1% of the game and doing like an alpha of your whole game, doing a draft of it, and then kind of going back and iterating on each little chunk. But then also I think like if you're new to making games, making art for games, finishing is the hardest bit. And like there's the metaphor goes around, like the first 90% of the game takes 10% of the time, and then you just get stuck on that final little bit and you're just like, I don't know when this is done. And the hardest thing to learn is just like, where's that finish line? And that, I think it can be difficult to accept you're not going to release it perfectly, because you can't release a perfect game. You'll always get that kind of tiny bit more. And so just learning to accept, again, like kind of Chris said, it's good enough. And that's it. And then I'm done when it's good enough. And, maybe your standards need to be lower if you haven't made things much. Obviously, if you're like a seasoned professional, you're probably not watching this panel because it's not really for seasoned professionals. It's for people who kind of are looking to get the beginner tips. And so, just have low standards, do it faster, release it imperfectly, use those lessons for the next time, and you'll kind of have a better feeling of how long it will take.
I also really like that point, Freya, about I mostly work with programming-centric people, and we'll refer to as first pass. I think I've seen also designers use the same phrase. And basically, does everything kind of exist at all before I then, like you said, look at bird's eye view as a set and be like, where's my energy well spent on cleaning it up? But it's just such a nice lens to not get stuck too long on one piece.
So the rabbit hole of doubt is especially it's especially dangerous for beginners, because the thing with when you start making a game, especially if it's a game that's going to have a fairly long development cycle or even a year development cycle, is you will inevitably get better at something, and then you'll go back and look at your old backgrounds or animations or whatever and think, oh my god, I could do this so much better now. And at that point you have to make the decision of whether it's worth it or not to make those changes, because you don't want to get stuck in the endless cycle of you go back and change them, and then you learn something else, and then you want to go back and change them again, and so on and so forth. So it can be tough to do that. That's probably one of the hardest things, but it goes back to what Freya was saying about finishing being the most important thing. And I feel like acknowledging that it's not going to be perfect is very important, but also to put a little bit more of a positive spin on it. I like to think, or I used to like to, I still do, I like to think it's the best that I can do at this time with my particular set of skills. Not it's not good enough or whatever, because then you can get into your own head about like, oh, what is good enough or whatever. But if you just are like, okay, well, I can do better next time, I know I'll do better next time, but for right now, this is what I can do, and I'm proud of what I can do now. That's like, for your confidence, there's like nothing better than that. And I mean, I still do that. Like, I had some backgrounds in a section that I was okay with, but then later on I was looking at the scenes and I was like, you know what, I should set this at golden hour. And so I went back and like I put a light filter on, or just put a color filter or an overlay filter, and made it look okay instead of redrawing the whole background. But it was only a few scenes. It was well within what I could do. It wasn't going to take too much time out of the project. So being able to recognize and understand what is worth it and what isn't is also very important.
Yeah, love the messages too of the needing to get it behind you, moving on from it. A bunch of people I work with basically try to teach them the learning is in hindsight. It's easier to wince about and then apply to the next project from the ground up instead of, like, say, chasing your tail indefinitely. We've got another question here from Robert Nomoslibor. Not sure quite how to pronounce the Twitter handle, but interested in making games for Playdate. would be interested in advice for making use of 1-bit, especially black and white or otherwise high contrast displays. And I think if I can start with Julia, do I recall you actually are involved with a Playdate title specifically? And some people also limited palette experiences as well, but
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I have I art directed and did art for a game for Playdate called Recommendation Dog. That was with Strange Scaffold and Sweet Baby Incorporated. And yeah, it was a really good experience. And I think with that in particular, because it is a low resolution screen, it's 400 by 240, 173 pixels an inch though, so it's actually really kind of small pixels as well. And another important consideration is that the screen is not backlit. And what I like to think of when you're designing for something like that, legibility, like being able to see the different elements on the screen is super important. I actually think of it like if you were doing an illustration, I used to do freelance illustration for like a newspaper because newsprint's kind of dull and it's like it's not going to be that super high contrast. It's so I think particularly with that type of a case where the display is this small, you have to make sure that you're looking at everything at 100%, just checking in on that a lot. Even if it's something like laser printing out your screen just to see what that looks like in terms of what the art is looking like on that screen, especially because it is not backlit. Another good thing to do is, yeah, just checking out like screenshots of Playdate games. Of course, we always go back to that, looking at examples, do your research, find out about how people are solving this problem. And there's like this infinite number of ways to do a Playdate game that can look good and distinctive with those limitations, because the limitations are actually kind of exciting to work with. Another thing to think about is no, I think that's it. I think just being super mindful about making things be as clear as possible on that screen.
A lot of my kind of initial working out how to develop an art style for making games was from making games with Bitsy, which is, for anyone who doesn't know it, it's a small little web engine for making pixel-based games. You have 8 by 8 tiles and kind of 16 by 16 maps of those tiles. And it's kind of close in concept. The screen's not the same size as for Playdate, and because it's on computer, you don't have the same concern about backlit or not. But at that small 1-bit resolution, you're not communicating and drawing like the thing you're drawing. You're not drawing a chair. You're very much drawing like the idea of a chair. And so trying to bear in mind that abstraction and think, what is the simplest way I can represent this item? And so, like a chair in real life has all these different kind of shades and shapes, and it's got rungs in the back and whatever. And in 1-bit, unless you are making a game about chairs, and you obviously need to spend the time and effort in making the most beautiful chairs, you can get away with like back, seat, leg. And I think I mentioned before in another question, like this is going to have to sit in a context. And so in the context of my whole room, if the room is kind of a very plain tiled floor, if there's walls, if the chair is kind of like 3 lines and it says that's a chair, that's all you need. And so kind of embracing a level of abstraction in what you're drawing is going to really help you, because otherwise you can go kind of insane trying to figure out the exact way to draw a perfect chair in like 10 pixels.
If you're developing for example, Playdate, you ideally work for a game, try to make a game that's meant to be seen by people who are expecting games that are going to have limited visuals. Your audience is already a part of your advantage as you try to figure out how to design shapes for them. So you probably don't need to surprise them, especially because they want to have something they can hold in their hand and spin this, I don't know, this corp and figure out how to make their character move and play for 10 minutes and put their game away. Then they don't need to have this amazing piece of art in front of them.
I've done a bunch of minimalist stuff, and what has helped me learn is by playing a bunch of minimalist stuff, is because then you get to see like it's analysis is part like, okay, how does this work in and of itself, and how does it work next to everything else? But then you also have to see, okay, how did these parts move, and were there any points that I had difficulties with? if you go into the original Pokemon games and it's like, oh, you know where the door is because it's always at the bottom part of the screen where there's a little bit of a carpet that lets you know that's where the door is, because they can't just represent it with like the back of a door or something. Or it's at the top of the screen where it's very clearly obvious against the wall. It's just weird little considerations like that that you play, you get an understanding with, and then you go, okay, how can I use this? Or, this didn't really work to me. Maybe I'm better off putting stools in my games than chairs. Like I can't find a way to make the backing look correct. So let's just change what we're doing there.
I got nothing for this one.
Fair enough.
I have another addition to that actually. In terms of like, yeah, what Damien and Freya are talking about in terms of like that realism aspect of it, and how I think maybe people who are beginning and who want to create art for games, they get hung up on this idea that things have to be realistic looking. And that's really not that important. And in fact, I think this idea of having a chair being symbolic of a chair versus a realistic depiction of a chair, it can be a lot more powerful as well. Damien mentioned playing games that are like super low res and super simple graphics. So that you can know that things work and stories can really be conveyed effectively, and gameplay can be conveyed effectively with very simple graphics, because that's been done like that in the past. For decades, it was done like that in the past. And a lot of really good books don't have pictures either. It's not a problem in terms of wanting something to be photorealistic or something. And actually the symbolic chair can be a lot more powerful than a realistic chair, because the more realistic you get with something, the more specific it is and the less universal it is. And it's harder sometimes for people to really connect with something that is so specific, where they suddenly say, well, I don't see myself in this, or I can't identify with that character. A lot of really powerful depictions of characters, you can't even see their faces, or they don't have a face, or they don't have a body, like in Road Warden. You don't even see yourself, right? It's not a necessary thing to say, I need a gorgeous graphic for this to be effective. Like that's not really the case at all. And I think it would be a shame for people to let that stop them from trying to create something that is super meaningful.
I like that Damien mentioning this thing of, okay, well, this is this power, right, of a solo or small team to be able to, not just the artist, but then change the plan. It's like the back of a chair is pain, make a stool. And I work with a lot of people who are on teams who may not be familiar with. You can also write pushback. You have information the other person doesn't even request it. A producer says, make me a chair. They don't know how much easier a stool is for this context. Bring it up. Be like, hey, would a stool work? And occasionally everybody benefits from those back and forths between roles too. I've got a question here from Fight XP, and this is one where I know, the brush doesn't make the artist, right? But still, it's just a very concrete question. It may not be a lot to discuss, but what's the software you're using for pixel art? What programs are you using? Are you all Photoshoppers? Are you Sprite? Something else entirely?
For the longest time, I did just use MS Paint. And nowadays I use paint.net, which just gives me a bit better control over things, lets me import custom palettes and stuff. So it's not a fancy program, but it is free. And sometimes it does plenty enough there. And then once you get used to where everything is, it moves along pretty quick.
I use Photoshop CS2. It works. I'm sure there's much better pixel art programs. I know there are, but I like CS2. It's what I'm used to.
If you want to draw your first or second or fifth picture, just use Paint. Just try to squeeze out of it whatever you can. If you want to put some funds into software that's specifically designed for pixel art, just buy Sprite. It's the most popular piece of software there is for pixel art. If you know how to draw, you'll find that many people who draw pixels, they either start from pixel art, and those usually focus on pixel art oriented software, but if they know how to draw or they use tablets instead of a mouse, those people probably already know how to use Photoshop or GIMP. And in that case, just use Photoshop or GIMP. Don't force yourself to fit some sort of software standard. No one's going to care. The only people who care usually are people on Facebook. You probably don't know this platform, but then there on every viral pixel art post, you're going to find people asking what sort of software you're using, which program do you use? That's usually the question. And people ask this because they seek this one tool that's going to solve their issues and it's going to push them to actually start drawing. And you don't need software to start drawing. There is enough free software that's going to help you do the basics. And if you know how to do the basics, you can then start to consider some more specific tool.
I'm a lifelong Photoshopper as well as Francisco. I also have dabbled in Sprite. There are actually some really nice pixel art features in Sprite that Photoshop does not have. So that I can see why there's the better pixel animation. There's some really nice dynamic dithering that can happen with it. So I do like Sprite. Another one that I have used is something called Medibank Paint. And that one is free actually. And I think there's a paid version for maybe $6 or something. And I have that one because I use it on my iPad. So if I'm on the go, if I'm going to be on a train or something, that's a really easy one for me to pick up. And it's full featured. It's got layers, and I can, use hex values to decide, to dictate my EGA color palette by hex value, which is really important for me. But yeah, most of the time it's Photoshop. But there's plenty of, you don't need to use Photoshop. Like Arius was saying, you don't need to. There's so many other things that are free or really reasonably priced. Sprite is reasonably priced. I think it's usually like $15 or $20 or something. But yeah, also free as well. Two things.
So everyone else stole the answer I was going to give. So, it's fun that we're all on the same page. But picking up on kind of like, it depends on what you use, whether you're like a mouse user or a tablet user or something. A lot of my art is photo manipulation and kind of crunching a photo down into pixels. It's a alternative way of getting nice pixel art as long as you have some kind of software that can do that. So, like Photoshop, GIMP, etc. It's a handy shortcut. As few are not that comfortable or skilled or practiced or whatever at kind of doing it manually. Having some kind of software that can manipulate and crunch stuff down into the form you like also helps. And I think some kind of dedicated pixel art software is not necessarily angled towards that as an approach. And so something like Sprite isn't really designed for, here's a full quality photograph and crunch and dither this down into something black and white. And so, you may find there's ways that you can get started making pixel art that don't necessarily use pixel art programs and offer you an alternative workflow.
Yeah, one quick thing I want to also say is just like, because a lot of what we've talked about is what we're comfortable with using. A lot of us have something that we got started with that we were like, okay, this is a very solid thing. But also to people who are just starting out, it's also a good idea to try out a program that you have no clue how to use, because that lets you see like, okay, these are tools that pixel artists are wanting in their programs. I don't know how to do this. Like there might be somebody who doesn't know what dithering even is, which that's its own conversation, because there's plenty of people who you figure that out and then you over dither everything. But yeah, there's everybody goes through the phase. But that's why I think it's important to also highlight that is, even if these programs seem daunting at first, like get the free trials, see how they work. And it's like, okay, this is what I should know, at least what it is. That way I know whether or not to use it.
Awesome. And I want to throw in there, and Pew's just going right, I am not an artist on the panel, very specifically, so listen to all these other folks. But a lot of other non-artists that I work with have been using something called Photopia. It's an in-browser knockoff of Photoshop. It's free if you don't mind the ads. So I want to throw in there's another free option people can try to explore. But again, disclaimer, listen to the artist for the actual art recommendations if you're serious about this stuff. So our next question comes to us from Mastodon user Token Rove. The question being, how did you first come up with a process that actually produced usable art? What kind of changes happened before it became the process you use now? If you've changed styles or tools between projects before, how would you adapt your process to those new tools? Basically, figuring out repeatable process is the thing they're struggling with most right now.
Learn how to swallow my pride and just ask people what they think. And they told me how to fix it. And they explained me that I don't know how to use isometric perspective. And they explained me how to draw isometric pixel art. Okay, so I had that thing solved. So I drew some new pieces and I presented them online, and people told me, okay, these colors, they don't match. They should be reversed. The path is too dark corresponding to the grass. You need to reverse the colors. So I reversed the colors. Oh, suddenly the things start to look better. So I didn't really try to build my esteem online by presenting my pictures. I just tried to learn how to draw better. And people were eager to teach me because those pictures were just so bad. And because I didn't argue with anyone, I actually was trying to learn something. I was so grateful to get all these comments I got. The feedback was saved me from months of just sitting alone in my room and trying to fix things that I just didn't have the template to even consider how to approach them. And others taught me how to approach the same topics better.
So I guess it's funny because I was just talking about this earlier today, like in the context of like confidence in your own art. Because like the game I'm doing right now, it's my fourth game. It's the third commercial game that I've done the art for. It's the second game I didn't do the art for, but it's the first one of my games where I look at it and I think, it's good. Like the previous one was like, it's not terrible. My first one I was just like, but what I guess the feeling of being overwhelmed of like how do I do this and how do I the question is about producing usable art, right? So like that feeling of like, well, how do I know if I'm good enough to do this consistently? It's a combination of, well, for me personally, I learned perspective because my first game I knew what perspective was, but I hadn't really studied it. So there's a lot of backgrounds that I look at and I'm like, this makes no sense at all in terms of like how the world works. Like that desk is pointing this way and anyway. So studying art definitely helps, obviously, but like specifically like, perspective, the fundamentals, things like that, how to put stuff together and be consistent in that aspect. And then also just kind of like, again, like we talked about before, just practicing and repeating and finding a style that works to the point where you feel comfortable enough doing it, and just learning things as you go. Like, between projects, I tend to study little things here and there, like lighting or color theory or whatever, just kind of try and apply it as I go. So the more you draw, say, it also depends on the type of games you're making, because like for me, making point and click adventures, you tend to run into a lot of similar things. Like we were talking about chairs before. Once you've drawn your 17th chair, you have a good idea of how chairs work, and you can start experimenting and making them look good rather than look functional. So I feel like when I felt I first came up with a process that actually produced usable art was, I guess, just when I got to the point where I was like, okay, I know that this background actually works from like a mechanical point of view, in that I learned perspective. And then also just having drawn so many backgrounds that I was like, okay, well, this door looks like a door. This building looks like a building. Now I just have to make them look better than just a building, like make it a unique looking building, that sort of thing. So I guess the short answer is practice, and then you'll eventually start making usable art.
What's the shortcut? Years of practice is like it's such a real answer, but I don't know. It's like
Yeah.
I started making games as like pure interactive fiction. So my first games were, I can't draw, I'm not going to draw, I'm just going to have words. And then kind of like after a few of them, I was thinking, I should probably do some pictures because it feels like it's missing something. And for years, I treated art in my games very much as a kind of necessary evil. And a lot of my working out a process that produced usable art was, okay, what is the least painful way to me personally of making this? And so kind of a lot of my games have been 1-bit pixel art, or they've been photographs, or they've been photo manipulation, or they've been do I even need a background? Can I get away with like a solid color? What's the least work I can do for any given moment? And through that kind of like trying to find shortcuts that produced some kind of like intentionality in the art. If I'm trying to illustrate a particularly dramatic scene, I've been thinking, what's kind of like the least I can do that still feels like it's doing the job that I want it to do, which is, have a bit of art in there to illustrate a point. And coming up with a process for that has been kind of like leaning on the minimalism or leaning on the kind of slight experimentation. And I feel like any art can be usable if you kind of believe in it and if you really kind of double down on it. And so if you feel like your art is a bit inconsistent and maybe kind of like some of it's nicer and some of it looks a bit weird, you can always kind of double down on that and go, I'm going to go for a kind of collage style. And so I'm going to ramp up the inconsistency. I'm going to, exaggerate. I don't think I'm very good, so I'm going to make it look really bad and kind of lean into that as a feature almost. And so I think like, we've kind of said before, like there's good enough, and there's also like, you don't have to do one particular style. And I think like having some kind of like intentionality and, like I am doing this art not because, I can't do anything else, but because, it's going to fit the job. However I've made it, however I've come up with it, whether it's, like taken a photograph, I've crunched it into too much dither and I'm going to be embarrassed about that in a year because everyone does lots of dither or whatever. Being able to just kind of get it done in a way that you find the least painful, I think is good, is going to be good. And then you can always finish that game and go, wow, I'm not doing that again. I hated that process. Let's never hand draw over images or something again.
I have some thoughts about it, but first, Arias, I don't think I was pronouncing your name correctly, and I want to get it. I want to nail it this time. So, can you just tell us how to pronounce your name properly? And I should have covered this at the start, so I'm so sorry. But
no, I've actually heard that the way you pronounce it is also something that would be intuitive, especially for Hispanic pronunciation. But it's not even a Polish word. It's word from Latin, and I just use Polish tradition of pronouncing Latin words. So
okay.
I don't expect anyone to know how this sounds. And I call myself Aureus.
Aureus? Aureus.
It ends with us.
As a meta note, Aureus, and again, please correct me if I'm doing it wrong too. Do you want this part included because you'd like people to be like learn how to pronounce your name, which like I'm 1,000% welcome, or you're like, you know what, let's not make it about that because I know you said like you're used to the other pronunciation too, so just want to get your preference on that, including this or cutting it out.
If you think it's entertaining.
I like people to hear how to learn to pronounce these things, and I want to work on it too. So I appreciate if you're okay with us including that.
I think one of the important things that Autos mentioned that we haven't really touched too much upon is, getting feedback from friends, from family, from social media. If you're brave enough, social media, I commend you for doing that. That can be a super helpful tool about improving your art, because you're not living in isolation, especially nowadays. There's so many ways to share your art and try to get feedback from people in different forums too, like maybe pixel art forums or whatever art you're doing specifically, or just more of a general thing. And that can be super helpful as long as you understand how to take in that feedback constructively and kind of like toss out the stuff that's maybe less constructive. But it can almost feel like a shortcut to instead of coming up with stuff on your own. So that's super valuable, and I think it's a really good way to go if you're just starting out with like no expectation about, okay, I know that this is just a work in progress and maybe I can get help here. And I think that's been a super worked super well in your advantage. To speak to Francisco's point about perspective and learning perspective, I actually, for my process of creating the rooms for my game, I got looser with it, and I actually am cheating perspective a lot more because I started to study the backgrounds, the Sierra adventure game backgrounds, and to break down what the perspective was doing in those games. And something that I think was and maybe another thing we didn't address yet is just about sprite scaling and about how, you know, if you're going to make a room with depth and even though the character's not scaling or anything, well, I found out pretty quickly that those old games really cheated the perspective, but it didn't really matter. People never really were bothered by it. And I never really noticed until I started taking a really good look at it. So I would like to say on that count that if you are able to convincingly fake it, then that's okay too, as long as it sits well with you and you think it looks fine, it doesn't bother you too much. Also, another aspect that Outers mentioned is just in terms of like working on something. This is something that people tend not to get told, and I had to figure this one out kind of on my own, is that no one's going to tell you to stop what you're doing, right? No one's going to say, you shouldn't be doing this. Don't do this anymore. Only you are going to be doing that. Only that's only in your own power as you're creating something to say to yourself, don't be afraid of, you know, oh, well, I shouldn't be doing this or I should stop doing this. Just continue to create and don't let that be a limitation at all, because no one's going to step in and say that. And even if they do, there's no reason to listen to them. There's absolutely no reason to not continue with what you're doing. But about the usable art process, so in terms of that, yeah, it's always going to be a balance between time invested and how satisfied you are with the outcome. And that's a constant balance that you're going to be trying to find. And that takes, yeah, I mean, that takes time and that takes work and that takes practice and understanding your processes that do continue to get better. So it kind of really is a moving target. That's a really difficult question to answer. Also, in terms of changing styles from project to project, I have a bit of experience with this because, you know, Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator was just like a one bit kind of like a green on black type of thing with much lower resolution than even I was used to working on. And Recommendation Dog as well for the Playdate did completely different as well in terms of the resolution and the color. But with those, it's a kind of a matter of the tools don't change, so that's not the difficult aspect. What, you know, that, so that got taken out of the equation altogether. I was using the same tools I was using for my own projects. Something to think about for changing styles is, you know, what kind of tone you want is the game trying to achieve. So Space Warlord is kind of a bit frightening looking. It's a little bit, you know, I was doing these trader portraits, so these organ trader portraits, and I did want to give them this feeling of kind of scary. Like it's kind of a scary kind of a thing. It's kind of a bizarre, surreal type of a game. But I was really fortunate because the person I was, you know, Xavier Nelson Jr. was really super open about what way I wanted to go with it. So I didn't really come across a lot of like resistance about what I was doing. So I think that also helps if you're collaborating with someone on a project that is going to kind of let you do your thing and have that kind of creative freedom. The repeatable process aspect of this, figuring out a repeatable process and struggling with that becomes an even bigger deal. Like this is not a beginner response to this question, but if you're going to become an art director for a game and directing the look of a game, so Recommendation Dog, I had a junior artist working under me who I had to create a style for that they could then replicate and be able to add their own imprint on it while everything kind of looked the same. And that kind of was solved really easily with the Playdate. Well, relatively easily, because yeah, it's a black and white and it's fairly low resolution. I consciously tried to make the art very simple so that they were able to replicate the style that I had decided on for the game, but still being able to be original in their own right, and also being able to give them good feedback about what they would need to change and being able to communicate that aspect. Although that's not like the repeatable process thing in that aspect is not really like germane to this conversation, but I did want to add that. And it also, I guess, speaks to when you're working on your own too, is that idea. We've already mentioned it a few times about trying to keep things as simple as possible.
I have two things I'd like to piggyback off of Julia's answer there. The first is about feedback. Yes, it's a very good idea to get somebody who will give you honest feedback, constructive criticism. You don't want to like, you know, show somebody who like your mom will be like, oh, that's so nice, I'll put it up on the refrigerator, even if it looks terrible. But at the same time, you also don't want to get somebody who's like, this sucks. Like, what's wrong with you? You want a nice balance in between. I have a very good friend who I will send stuff off for feedback every now and then, and he'll give me back like big circles, like fix this. And he every time he finds a tangent in my backgrounds, he's like, what's wrong with you? But we have that kind of relationship, so it's valuable feedback, and I look for things myself now, and like I'm always the tangent police of my own backgrounds. So yes, it's important to get to get feedback and make sure you get it in such a way where it doesn't crush your soul, but also doesn't give you a false sense of not recognizing your mistakes. So the other thing is, as far as like being able to cheat perspective, yes, I also noticed that too, because when I was doing my studies, the most frustrating thing was like you're trying to learn it and then you see other people are cheating it, but it's like the old classic example of Picasso, who knew how to draw people perfectly but would distort them. You have to learn the basics and the fundamentals before you can start bending the rules and breaking the rules, because you have to have an understanding of what you can get away with. There's a huge difference between looking at a picture drawn by somebody who has no idea how perspective works and a picture where someone has like wonkified the perspective. It'll still, you can't maybe put your finger on exactly why one works and why one doesn't, but it's because the artist who understood the rules of perspective understood how they could break them and still make it look good. So if you're a beginner and you don't have that knowledge, your best bet is to stick with the proper technique. And maybe your backgrounds will look rigid and mechanical, but if that's what you can do at the time, again, like that's what you should do, because it's like one of the follies I see a lot, specifically in people making like indie point and click adventure games, is if they want to make it look cartoony, they always go to Day of the Tentacle as a source. And Day of the Tentacle is a great looking game, but again, it's also done by artists who understood how you could break perspective. And a lot of people often think that that just means, well, I'm just going to make this door look this way, but then they just completely get it wrong. So yes, you have to understand the rules before you can break them.
This actually reminds me, part of the, to your earlier discussion about perspective reminds me, I think it was Sergio in one of our, I think he's one of our European members. He needed a background in 2D that had correct perspective. His hack, right, a programming strength person, was set up some cubes in Unity, took a screenshot, basically rotoscoped drawing over the 3D renderings perspective, and then added his details for where he needed them. And, got the perspective right as a starting point. And I really, really love y'all's focus on feedback. And this is where, I mean, obviously we're putting this video out there for everybody to see, but I also know a lot of my students, members, people I train are watching it too. Really we call attention to, out of those things that we take for granted, people in art schools, art classrooms are learning, right? There's like, first of all, anatomy or how to use your brush, but a lot of it is also how to take feedback, how to seek feedback, how to filter for feedback worth taking, and realizing that's its own skill to be practicing and appreciating that there's folks who aren't asking for feedback and are worse for it. And a lot of people that got to get over that hurdle of being defensive or not seeking it or feeling like I'm just going to do whatever and it's going to be right because I did it. And no, you're doing something for somebody else. Figure out if it's serving their needs somehow, right?
To jump on that feedback one a little bit, when I was kind of trying to develop my art, I always found the best source of feedback was looking for other game devs who are at the same kind of level as you, who are, they're looking for feedback, they're learning their own art, they're learning their own game dev practices. So are you can see kind of like stuff in each other's work that you miss, and like this isn't coming from someone who knows nothing, it's not coming from someone who's like an industry professional who I find quite scary. It's, that kind of peer-to-peer feedback where you're just helping each other up. That always felt like the most valuable feedback, and also kind of the easiest to take on a kind of emotional level, because I knew it's coming from somewhere, relatable.
One key person that I used to get feedback from was actually my grandma. I would send her my projects because she knows nothing about games. And so this is a person who, if they have no background knowledge, no understanding of how things are supposed to work, A, it's great for writing tutorials, but B, if she doesn't recognize that it's a door, it's not a door. And I need to fix that.
Yeah, I'm going on to a lot of what we've been talking about feedback and perspective and getting that, especially that peer feedback is, I guess we didn't really address this, but yeah, I'll cop to it. I went to art school. I know this is a panel. I know this is a panel for, a game art for non-artists. And I have a bachelor's of applied art illustration. I was a freelance illustrator for 10 years. I did do all the technical drawing and all that stuff. I received that training. I did, although I still feel like I don't know anything about it though. And I don't even try to make it accurate, even though I'm ostensibly supposed to know how to do that. I don't address it really in my own work. But yeah, I mean, you look at this thing behind me. I didn't do a perspective thing for this. This doesn't work. This is all cheated. This is an illusion. Yeah, I'm even looking now, like the closest walls should probably angle out more like this than they do. And it's okay, whatever. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do learn in art school is this idea of giving feedback and receiving feedback in a constructive way, particularly with peers. It's super important as well. Of course, with the instructor and too, but yeah, with the peers, it's super key to get that feedback. For me, coming from the arts background first and then coming into games, I do see that, yeah, people have all these ideas, these preconceived notions about what it would mean to make art for games. And I'm coming at it from a completely different angle in it, where I can say, you know what, don't even worry about that stuff. I can say that though, because as Francisco said about perspective, is I guess I have some vague instinct for it now because of the training I've gotten. So it's easy for me to say, oh, just fake it, whatever, and it'll look kind of fine. I can only say that because I probably, got that training. So I will cop to that. That's probably not necessarily a realistic expectation of people who are coming into this new.
Well, I want to echo both that point as well as I think Freya, the one who brought it up, and this is just my lens as a professional teacher. There is this very, very, very important point about peers learning from peers, because our peers make the kind of mistakes we make. And this is often a problem. People look at like top selling work, best stuff in the world on Steam or whatever. Those people aren't making the kind of mistakes beginners are making. And so you don't see the problems that otherwise, if like say even a speaking class, right? Your classmates are giving speeches. They're making the mistakes we make. We wince at it. We don't hear it in ourselves. We hear it in them. We learn from it. It's so valuable to figure out who's at my budget, who's at my scale, who has my kind of time constraints. How do I learn from my peers? And we get so much more footing there than just like straight to Picasso. There's so many layers.
Julia may correct me if I'm wrong, but the people I asked who go to art school or went to art school told me about the months and years they spent practicing their hands to make just the correct curved lines, to actually have hands that follow their intents that are counterintuitive for human beings. And it's amazing that right now we can use those different tools, such as software that's designed specifically for using mouse and drawing pixels, or we can indeed mesh photographs and deepfake them into making them look like something unique and unusual, and to depict something that has pragmatic utility for us. And all these different tools are amazing advantage, and the fact that we can also seek feedback online, there are so many opportunities that can just throw us miles ahead in comparison what the previous generations had to went through to produce the traditional work. And I think that's fantastic. In my case, for example, I went from knowing nothing about pixel art to making pictures for Road Warden in about 2 years. But from this, the actual drawing process took maybe 5 to 7 months of actual learning. The rest was working on other aspects of my games and considering what mistakes. I needed some time to get some perspective and to look at my pictures once again and to see, oh, those actually make no sense in some regards. But you can find online many different people showing how much they were able to learn when it came to pixel art in, for example, 1 year or 3 years. And this is amazing what people can figure out pretty much either on their own or just by following tutorials and guides and seeking feedback online.
Julia, perfect example. The background behind you, drawn by somebody who clearly understood the rules of perspective. This was clearly drawn by someone who had no idea what perspective was. I mean, look at those floor tiles. So, yeah.
I appreciate that. I always have this idea where I just kind of undersell how I feel about my own abilities. I never think anything of it really, and I never think, oh, I hate perspective. I hated that class, so probably I don't know anything about it. But yeah, what Aurus is talking about, it's an exciting time for people because we have access to these tools, and anyone can have access to these tools and the online tutorials, feedback on social media and with family and friends, and being able to learn all this stuff on your own is really, really exciting to me. Even stuff like, yeah, I mean, in art, a lot of times it's not even just like the knowledge, it's actually you're training your body, right? You're training your like your dexterity too. That's a whole other thing. And that's why it can take hundreds of hours to like really feel more comfortable with drawing. It's not just, it's like you're starting to use chopsticks, right? Like if you know the process of doing that, you've seen tutorials, it's not going to be the same as actually picking up chopsticks and learning how to use them. Like you need to go through that process. Saying that though, I mean, there are now tools online where, you can have tolerance on your brush in like Photoshop and in other programs where, yeah, if your hand is not as steady or you're not as dexterous with that, you've got these programs that will smooth out those lines for you and make it more, a way that you might not physically be able to ever achieve, really. Having those helping things is super, super great. And I love the fact that, yeah, I mean, people like Aurelius can come in and have no art training. He still doesn't consider himself an artist, you guys. Like which I think is incredible because he said this to me, and I'm kind of blown away because looking at Road Warden is completely amazing. And knowing that someone can go in such a short time from having done, maybe no art, I'm not sure, but I'm almost no art, to coming out with this wonderful game that has really affected people in a lot of different ways. This is a whole other thing, but I don't think you need to go to art school to feel like you can do art for a game. Definitely not. Absolutely not. I think this panel completely shows that that's not necessary in so many different ways.
Speaking of which, and if only because Julie has opened that can of worms, anyone else have some background you'd like to, not that you were hiding from us, but just to acknowledge, like, hey, just to clear, like, my lens is coming from, I professionally designed posters for 20 years and didn't tell y'all. There, just something, right? I was an animator for Disney. Any of those in your closets you want to bring up here?
I dropped out of art school.
There we go.
But I also didn't learn perspective while I was in art school. So take that, education system.
Different people get different things out of it. Connections, experience, confidence, right? There's other things perhaps, but
yeah, I mean, like I studied to be a music recording engineer, which is not something that my career turned into at all. And so, all of the doing art for games, doing writing for games, doing, design and programming and stuff. It's all, I know this is a panel on like, being an artist in a game without that training, but, all of it is stuff you can self-teach. All of it is just, you just fiddle, you just practice, and those skills all come up regardless of what your training or background is. Obviously, music came a bit easier for games because, I'd studied all that, but, you've probably got a skill that you've developed that you can use as like, here's my strong point in making this game, and everything else I'm going to kind of, learn how to support that strong point that can kind of anchor everything else around it.
Yeah, I joked about swallowing my pride a few minutes ago, but it was actually a very important skill that I took as I was writing poetry, and I got criticisms tied to the types of verses I used and words and the length and the titles, and there were so many things that I could correct that I was happy to be criticized by my work and for my work. And this type of mental attitude is extremely important when it comes to learning anything that is going to be judged by others, and keeping this focus. What's my actual goal? So my goal was to make pictures that were good enough to serve in a game that's mainly focused on its writing and its atmosphere. And I didn't try to become someone who would get some sort of validation just by the pictures they're making. So I think it's important to remember who you are, no matter if people are going to criticize your work or praise it or give you advice how to fix it.
I have no background education. Like, I know nothing. I've just made enough stuff to where now people say I know things, and I'm like, great, cool. I will still continue varying processes in order to keep things fresh.
Experience
on.
is the best teacher.
What I want to acknowledge too from Francisco, it was an earlier note you had made about how you went out of your way, right, to study perspective and study these things. And I like that as a point from both, like say, dropped out of art school, but also it's not like you're anti-learning. You're like, well, you're going out of your way to still learn, right? You're not just doing what comes naturally and then spend enough years doing that. You're like, there's concepts you want in your head. You go out, you study it, you put in the time on it. That's awesome. Just want to acknowledge that.
Can I throw out a plug? I'm not being
Please
paid
do.
for this, but I found this book incredibly beneficial. So I highly recommend Color and Light by James Gurney. It's more for realistic painting, but there's lots of stuff in there for anyone interested in improving their art in any way, shape, or form. So highly recommend that.
I'm actually glad you opened that thread, because even though there's not a question we had from the thing, this is another of those great points to kind of launch pad from the ending on of, is there a tutorial series you found on YouTube that was super helpful? Is there some trainer out there that was just like you learned so much from, you want to acknowledge or shout out to? Stuff that they can go from this and they'll Google, learn something else based on things you found helped you. Anybody else here?
I guess it's not really like a resource you can go up and look now, but all of my early games were game jams. And so they were like, okay, you have a very short set amount of time, 2 days, a week, a month, something like that. And I found that just forcing myself to, do what I can in a short space of time, finish, close that book, move on, do it again. I found I improved a lot quicker by doing very, very short little bites of work than I would have from being like, right, I'm going to make, a big game as my first one. I'm going to spend, 2 years on it. I'm going to run into that thing where it's like 1 year down the line. Oh, I don't like my old art now. I'm going to redo that. I'm going to get caught in this kind of snake eating its tail loop. And instead, just, that resource of, there's lots of community game jams out there who you can join, and everyone is on the same level of like, we're doing this in 1 week. That really helped at first.
I found watching Bob Ross has been really helpful. Just strictly like, partly just, the fact that talent's a pursued interest and you are what you repeatedly do. But, he has a palette of like maybe 8 colors each time. And then it's just like half an hour later, here's a whole painting. And it's like, okay, there's certain things about that process that's still applicable to what we do. So
he's so soothing too.
Yeah, I'm a major studier and proponent of Bob Ross and his philosophy. Two just things I want to hang on to that, because again, like, I love Bob Ross. One is, like, say that philosophy separate from painting stuff, right? Which is applicable to anybody. If they want to be a good boss, they want to be a good musician, programmer, whatever. It's just a nice mentality to have. Let Bob Ross into your brain. But then secondarily, this is because I used to do some speed coding stuff, right? Fundamentally, Bob Ross's techniques are also kind of speed painter, because he's got to finish a painting in 30 minutes. There's a set of techniques that are conducive to, I can paint mountains, trees, clouds, water very, very efficiently. Could you take the same technique and do, I don't know, a portrait? Question mark. But this is where we talked about this panel. Sometimes it's a matter of like, well, what fits the time frame I have? What fits the skills and the strengths and the techniques that I don't have an art department? So what can I do within, this time I got? And so just 2 things I like to grab onto Bob Rossisms. Any other outside shout-outs for other books, resources, tools, people like Bob Ross I should know about that I don't?
For pixel art specifically, there is this website lowspec.com, and lowspec has pretty much a base of all sorts of color palettes and tutorials. And I believe it's not been updated for a few years now, but it collects all sorts of tutorials with animations and sprites, and it even, for some reason, contains a few tutorials from as far back as 2001, I believe. And it's funny to just see how disgusting internet used to be, and all the ancient websites with their archaic designs. And well, that's fun.
There's a blog called Nature in Color, which is naturalpalettes.tumblr.com, which is just a bunch of like really nice nature photography, but then underneath they've broken it down into the palette. And so that's a nice resource if you want to like get an idea of the kind of colors that you find in nature, or the surprise that you get sometimes thinking that something is green when actually it's gray, or yellow when it's actually when it looks green. So yeah, and it also hasn't been updated since apparently 2018, but it's got a lot of good resources.
a lot of our styles are either from the 80s or from Game Boy era. Also, like, how much has color theory changed in 2,000 years, question mark, right? Like, some of these are probably pretty stable, question. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. That's a real question. I don't have the same eye y'all do.
I think when you're making art for games, I think the best outside resources, yeah, like I think Damien said, just looking at other games, right? And not even just looking at them, if you can, and if you have it available, playing them, because it's a completely different experience when you're just looking at a screenshot versus actively engaging in something, because your mind will fill in those blanks where maybe the graphics aren't there, but that actual process can be very pleasurable too. So I do recommend, like, just finding not even stuff that is coming out now, but older stuff too. I mean, the internet's a great place to find older stuff and see how things were solved back when they couldn't solve things any other way, but also see how things can be improved in terms of especially with like narrative games. There are a lot of game design issues with earlier narrative games that we've kind of dispensed with as we've moved forward in developing games that hopefully more people will be interested in playing. But yeah, I mean, there's so many wonderful, especially on itch.io, you can find a lot of really great just independent games. Like, yeah, I mean, Damien has the Cannibal Interactive itch.io. Freya has also her site as well. And that's a great place to start if you're looking for the little projects and seeing how people solve those problems.
Kind of talking about like looking back at older games as well, and kind of looking at examples like that, I think it's very easy to go and think of like, oh, I'm going to look at old LucasArts games or something that, everyone knows has a very recognizable and appealing style. But, I think if you spend some time looking at contemporaries of older games like that, you realize actually a lot of these don't have that kind of like top tier style, and they've still been released. People have still completed them. People have still said, this art, then it did the job. We did, maybe the perspective is a lot worse than, some others that are held up as classics of the genre. But, functionally, not all games are, amazing in production and scope and effect. And they're still released. They're still finished. People have still played them, bought them. Somewhere out there, someone has a very fond memory of a game with, very rough around the edges art. And that's great.
I'll do you one other. I was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art recently with my friend, the same friend who criticizes or gives me feedback. And he was pointing out all of the tangents in the classic art. And I was like, if there's art hanging in a museum that gets away with this, or that got away with this, then I shouldn't be so hard on myself for my game art. So take that to heart, everyone beginning out there. We all got to start somewhere, and no one's going to care.
Speaking of, going to the museum, going to look at medieval art and seeing like little babies that look like just little tiny adults. Sure. I mean, I think that can be also super helpful, and not just from an aspirational perspective, but from this is okay. Like, this is still valid. This is still enjoyable. When Freya mentioned, older games, and actually taking note of those older games and saying, the art wasn't like top tier art really. And these games are kind of really difficult in very annoying ways, but still that people have enjoyed them and have fond memories of them. And I've actually done something consciously. I stream on Tuesdays, and I do art dev streams. So I do that, but I end the evening with, I've been doing like Let's Plays. And I've been playing older games, especially like the same color palette that I'm using, this EGA 16 color palette. And I've really been enjoying like delving into those smaller studios that release stuff that I didn't know about, that were using the same color palette, so I can see how they use this color palette. And I'm learning a lot from seeing the older stuff that I had never seen before. And also from a game design perspective, playing those games and coming upon those friction points of, ooh, I don't like this limited inventory, or ooh, I don't like how there's an important item in this room, but it's not in the verbal description or the visual description of this room. Stuff like that. It's super, really, really good lessons to learn from a visual perspective and a game design perspective.
What is pixel art but modern day pointillism? Like we get in there to the details, but then you also have to step back and appreciate the bigger picture.
Maybe we can call it pixelism or something instead.
there it is. Well, and so we've given some shout outs to outside things. I also want to make sure we include, as maybe kind of a wrap up thing, shout outs to your own things, just very directly, right? Google this, or find me on Steam here, or look up this game name, or watch me stream on which day of the week. Anybody want to kick us off here with just sort of a closing where to keep following your thoughts, find your other content, check out your games, any of that kind of stuff.
I have a bunch of games online at communistsister.itch.io. That's where I put all of my releases, and my Twitter handle has been sat in the corner of my little webcam window here for the whole time, so you can find me there. All my links are from there. Self-promo.
Okay, I'm gonna do it. I'm cool with it. I actually don't mind doing self-promo because the way I see it is I'm performing a service to hopefully people who don't know about my game who would really enjoy it. I want to get in front of those people and kind of have them get to have this experience of playing my game or my demo. So I feel like it sounds so bad. I shouldn't even say it this way, but it's like I'm doing them a favor. That sounds terrible, but anyway,
No,
it's fine.
it's completely. I do a lot of sales work. Yes, you're doing them a favor if you're connected and who wants to find out about it, and they do. That's why they're watching this. They want to see examples of the kind of stuff we've been discussing.
Ugh.
Where do they find it, Julia?
Okay, yeah. So you can find everything. There's thecrimsondiamond.com. So you can Google the Crimson Diamond and it comes up like first, I think, which is like, yay, I won Google. Yeah, so thecrimsondiamond.com is where you can find me, all the social media stuff. I'm at Julia Minamata on Twitter. I do have a Twitch channel, _Maple Mystery, but you can find all that stuff up. But yeah, I stream Tuesdays, 8 p.m. Eastern, either art or music. I have a wonderful musician with me, Dan Polakar, and I do everything except for the music, and he does that, and we will compose a track live on stream from pretty much beginning to end when he joins me on those. So there's that. And I think, yeah, that's about it. I have a Patreon if people want to like figure that out or something. And yeah, I also I have a YouTube channel where I put all my streams up in case it doesn't really fit with people's schedules to check in live. Oh, it's on Steam too. It's on Steam. Please wishlist my game on Steam, The Crimson Diamond. Yes. Okay. I'm good.
I've made a bunch of games, so I'm not sure which ones exactly to promote. Like if you want an enjoyable one that's still fairly minimalist in style, Purgatory Dungeoneer. That one had multiple people working on it, so you know it's better. There's if you're really looking for like the Game Boy style and you're fine with pseudo 3D, it's 6 random characters in a single floor dungeon. That's the whole game. And then if you really want to see how minimal you can take graphics with like Atari level stuff, there is a game called Damian Crawford's Golf Experience 2022. Those are on Steam. Those are on my itch. If you play them, I apologize.
My main game is Road Warden. It's the first game I made that's actually successful at what it tries to do. I'm going to probably soon, not exactly know when, but I'm going to soon announce my next project, and I'm very excited about it. And I mainly use Twitter, where I use the tag moral anxiety. And you can find me also just by Googling Road Warden. I have a website, moralanxiety.com, but most news are usually updated just on Twitter. And if you want to buy a game, you can buy it on Steam, on itch.io, on a few different shops. So just select the one you like the most. And big thanks to Julia and Chris for setting this meeting up.
So I am at Brundislav Games on Twitter and on Mastodon. I also stream my game development every Wednesday. I call it Wild West Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern on twitch.tv/Brundislav. And I also mostly do art, but sometimes I'll do programming. I'm at the point in the project now where I sometimes do voiceover editing. I also have a YouTube channel where I've been trying to be better about putting like behind the scenes stuff. So I have like a bunch of behind the scenes videos with recording with the voice actors. That's also Brundislav Games on Twitter. On Twitter, on YouTube. Too many social media platforms. You can find my games on Steam and on GOG.com. They are A Golden Wake, Shardlight, most recently Lamplight City. I'm currently working on Rosewater, which will hopefully be out later this year. And you can also find my freeware series Ben Jordan Paranormal Investigator on itch.io. I believe I'm also Brundislav there. So yeah, if you want to see my journey from a 2-week game that looks terrible with nothing going for it and no perspective, to some slightly decent art in Lamplight City, you can check all of those out. And yeah, thanks so much for organizing this and having me on. I had a great time.
For me, I don't really call attention to my games anymore. I hope other beginning game developers around the world. I'm not an artist, by the way, to clarify, in terms of my core strengths. Most people in production and programming and design. But essentially, I hope people who have not finished projects learn to finish projects. People who have not worked with teammates learn to work with teammates. People who have not hit a deadline on a longer schedule, how to do that. Those are the kind of things I work with people on. That's what we do in HomeTeam GameDev, including, if you search for HomeTeam GameDev, you'll find the podcast where we've had hundreds of speakers over 7 or 8 years. We have a monthly person visit us from industry to talk about what they've done, what challenge they're into, what they like about their stuff, what advice they have for somebody who wants to become like what they're doing in the future. And this is kind of content like this panel we're trying to put out there to help more people get their footing in. Okay, they've done some jams, they've watched some tutorials, they want to start doing stuff more seriously. And so I really want to thank all y'all for being here today. Share what you can. And I also want to encourage, as kind of a call to action to the audience, if you're watching this, put on panels with your friends if you know stuff you'd like to share, right? You don't necessarily need someone's permission to be on a stage somewhere. If you know stuff, you know people, share your knowledge. It's great to do. It's a lovely way to get to know more friends online from all over the place. This is a lot of fun. I want to thank you all again for being here. And including also, thank you, Julia, for helping set this up, organize, find panelists, and so on.
Oh, no, thank you. Shout out right back at you, Chris, for like even approaching me saying, hey, do you want to do a thing? And I'm like, sure, let's do a thing. That'd be fantastic. And thank you to everyone who did come and was so wonderful about participating and being super fast on replies and stuff. So yeah, kudos to that too. This is one this turned out like better than I could have even have expected. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hey!